My book is called The End is the Beginning, A Personal History of My Mother. And I always knew that I wanted to write a book about my mother because she led a very, she was buffeted by circumstances outside her control through her lifetime. And but I didn't know how or when I could really write the book. And it wasn't until my mother passed away during the first month of COVID, when there were these restrictions, if you remember, where you had to quarantine for 14 days before you could enter any kind of facility. And my mother was living in Cleveland, and she was suffering from the end stages of Alzheimer's. And I was in New York. And when I was told by the social worker that my mother was in hospice and coming to the end of her days, I desperately wanted to be there with her. I always thought that I would be with her when she passed away. And it was really difficult that I couldn't go because of the restrictions. And I wouldn't have even been able to, if I could have gotten on a plane, I wouldn't have even been able to get into the care home without 14 days quarantine. So I recognized that that wasn't going to be possible. And I witnessed the burial, the graveside, not the graveside ceremony through FaceTime with my sister who lived in Cleveland. And so it was really difficult to process my mother's death, not being there. And I began to write the first chapter or the opening of the book from that perspective of my grieving for her and how surreal it was. And then I wrote another piece about the last year when she was in the care home, and life was very challenging for her and me at that point. And so I just started thinking about writing it this way. And I remembered that I went to, I don't know if you saw the movie or the play by Harold Pinter. Now I'm forgetting the name of it, but it will come to me. Who that story is told from the end of an affair to the beginning of the affair. And I remember I bought the screenplay to read it. And I don't know, it really didn't help me, but it was an interesting thing to do. And then I had pages of this book, and I went to a residency at the T.S. Eliot House. And of course, I then started reading T.S. Eliot's poetry, and I was reading the four quartets. And there is this line, the end is the beginning, this idea that I use in the epigraph of my book. It goes, what we call the beginning is often the end, and to make an end is to make a beginning. The end is where we start from. And so his conceit in the poem is really how the beginnings of our lives are always with us at our end, and that our ends are informed by our beginnings. So that just clicked in for me, that it would be really interesting, since my mother's, many of her cognitive abilities were being erased by Alzheimer's. What if I could make her slowly come alive again by telling the story in this reverse chronology? And once I discovered that, it really was kind of a breakthrough. It really compelled me, and it was challenging because you have to withhold information because you don't want to reveal too much about what's going to come next. And but I'm glad I persisted. My mother has just died It is March 29th, 2020, a cold, brutal late afternoon. No sun, only a white, lifeless sky. We're on Long Island. We left the city for our weekend house 2 weeks ago, and then COVID struck, and with no end in sight to the pandemic, we've been isolating here. I think of Camus' famous opening line in The Stranger. My mother died today, or maybe yesterday. I don't know. I too feel this strange distortion of time, maybe because of COVID and because not only am I trapped on Long Island, but I'm far away from Cleveland where I grew up, where my mother died and lived all 86 years of her life. Outside, two construction workers are demolishing the old deck attached to our house. Everything feels out of whack. Through the window, I watch workers with masks on strip down the floorboards of the deck and, like pallbearers, carry the warped strips of wood to the dumpster. We had planned for a new deck before COVID hit, hired an architect and a contractor, but now with the pandemic blazing, it seems unnecessary and indulgent. There's too much change, but it's too late. We've already made the investment. And Jake, that's kind of an the first chapter of the book is kind of for me an example of how poetry has informed my prose, because throughout that chapter we follow also this deck coming down, and that kind of became a metaphor for my grieving and my kind of breaking down, and then watching the deck being rebuilt. So, and that kind of just happened sort of magically. I didn't think that that would become a metaphor.